Great, let's get started. Can you hear us in the back? Fine, everything's good. Okay, thank you all. My name is not James Murombedzi. I'm Matt Somerville. Our moderator is a little late this morning, so we'll get things started and maybe hand it over in just a bit. We'd like to welcome you to today's event on focusing on the role of strengthening land and resource rights and equity in REDD Plus programs. This event is a merger of 3 different sessions. So we have a broad variety of sponsors ranging from USAID, C4, IUCN, the Leibniz Center, IIED, and WWF. We have a session of panelists and presenters this morning. So we're going to start with 3 sort of overarching presentations, followed by some reflections from panelists on their personal experiences in strengthening resource rights and working on equity in REDD, and then we'll have them reflect as well on the panel or the presentations. There is also Spanish and French translation in the back in case you need it. We'll welcome questions from the audience. What we're going to do sort of after the first presentation is hand out some cards. So please submit questions, and then we'll sort of choose from them which ones we would like to answer. So hopefully that's amenable.
There is no Spanish translation, only French.
Oh, I'm sorry, there is no Spanish translation. There's just a booth back there for Spanish translation. Thanks, translators. Great. And also, if you do have any particular examples, comments, experiences on your personal experiences in this realm, we'd love for you to actually present them to us by giving your project your name and contact information, because we do want to hear all the interesting examples. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Andrea Quesada, who is a consultant with the International Institute for Environment and Development. She's based in Costa Rica and works primarily on establishing the links between social and environmental issues and promoting these to be integrated into national REDD Plus processes. And trying to help make REDD equitable and take steps to become socially transformative. So, thanks, Andrea. I think you can speak, or if you'd like to use it.
Maybe I'd like to use this. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming so early today in the morning. It is a true honor to be here, and first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting us here and for giving us the opportunity to be able to share with you the journey that we've embarked, Phil and myself and some of the REDD SES Secretariat, around a year and a half ago to try to understand what does equity mean for REDD. So just to start us off in this journey, what we realized when we started working is that equity is a diverse landscape. It is a diverse social landscape. And when we talk about equitable REDD, we usually think, and the first thing that comes to our mind is, of course, securing land tenure. The second thing that comes to our mind is usually the equitable benefit sharing. But today I'm here to tell you that even though these 2 aspects are key and crucial to ensuring that REDD is equitable, there are many more issues and elements that need to be taken into account, such as participation, recognition of stakeholders, different social benefits, access to information, access to justice, and of course, the respect and protection of rights. So with this social diverse landscape that we've had, filled with valleys of inequalities and peaks of recognition and of respect of rights, we needed to start somewhere. And to be able to understand this diverse landscape, what we did was to propose a framework that includes 3 dimensions. And today, my presentation is going to focus on understanding these 3 dimensions at different levels, at a policy level, at the implementation level, and as well as understanding some of the issues that are correlated among the 3 elements. So when we started the process of defining the framework, we were debating a lot if it was going to be a 3-dimension, a 2-dimension. Those of you that are familiar with the literature in equity are familiar of seeing the procedural and distributive equity dimensions, and usually recognition is included within procedure. Now, for us, when we started this project, we thought that it was very important to have a separate dimension of recognition, because when we're talking about REDD, there are some crucial issues that do fall on this dimension. The first one being quite important is the recognition of all stakeholders. We know that in the forest sector, it is common that some stakeholders are forgotten, to say it in a nice way, and that is usually women and youth who are left aside. We also thought it was really important because it is in this recognition dimension where you're going to have the respect, the protection and fulfillment of rights related, of course, to land tenure and many other human rights. So what we found when we started looking more in depth into the 3 dimensions was that these dimensions were not kind of a straightway forward. These dimensions included many issues and elements. They were more of this landscape. And this was determined by the country context. And so depending on the country context or the local level context, wherever you're looking at, that is going to depend what is going to be found in these different dimensions. Since it can be so diverse, then what we did was to propose certain guiding principles to help us understand what were these elements and these issues under each one of the contexts. So for recognition, we identified 2 main principles that will help us, again, identify the issues and elements related to equity that REDD could address. So the principles for recognition are the recognition and respect of rights, the respect of knowledge and institutions. When it comes to the dimension of procedure, we find that we have 3 main principles: effective participation, the access to information and capacity building, and the access to justice. When we have distribution, we have these 5 different principles that will guide how the benefits will be allocated. And of course, they could be allocated equally according to the contribution to mitigation, according to rights, to reflect on costs, and according to basic needs. Now, these principles with regards to benefit sharing can seem that they are mutually exclusive. But in a couple of more slides, I will show you what we found when we started looking at them at the subnational level, and they're not mutually exclusive. So now we have the framework, we have the conceptual framework, and the next step was to be able to understand what does this framework look like in the real world. So to do so, what we did is we went to La Península de Yucatán in Mexico and to the San Martin region in Peru, and we asked the following questions. We asked, what does equity mean and how does it relate to REDD? We asked ourselves, how is equity addressed in the REDD Plus processes? And how can equity be strengthened in the national and regional processes? Now, to be able to answer these questions, what we did was to take a multi-method approach where we did an international and national policy analysis to be able to understand how equity is defined at a legal level. We did several interviews with equity focal points to be able to understand their perceptions regarding equity and the recommendations that, of course, they have to strengthen equity. And then we did several participatory workshops where we asked participants how activities that reduce deforestation and forest degradation could also contribute to strengthening and promoting the 3 dimensions of equity. And the way that we did that was developing some theories of change that I will show you in a bit. So now I'm going to share some of the results. I'm going to go very quickly over these, and I invite you to read more about it in our briefing that is outside. If you're interested in reading more about the examples and the findings, and we do have very exhaustive country reports that also include all of the information. But to sum up, okay, so how is equity addressed in international policies and mandates? Well, The general message is that we see equity principles being mainstream throughout all of the human rights law relevant to REDD, and as well the multilateral environmental agreements or the Rio Conventions. The champion being, of course, the CBD that has equity as a core principle of the convention and in a number of decisions. Now, with regards to the UNFCCC, equity principles have been incorporated in the REDD decision since COP13, and even though the word equity is not there, or equitable, the decisions do incorporate these equity principles. Very quickly, just to show you, here is a sum up of all of the decisions from Bali to Warsaw. And this is just to show you that these decisions reflect on the 3 dimensions of equity. An example, in Copenhagen, it was recognized that the full and effective, for example, participation and engagement of indigenous people in local communities has a potential to contribute, for example, to MRV. So that has a clear recognition and procedural equity dimension to it. Now, the other important decision, which my colleague Phil Franks is going to talk more about, is with regards to the safeguards. And when you look at the REDD safeguards, you see that these safeguards do have elements that are related to the 3 dimensions. A, to the 3 dimensions, B, to the 2 dimensions, C, to recognition, D, of course, is procedure, and E, which I apologize, is the line's a little bit wonky. E could have a distributed dimension based on how the countries are interpreting what social equity, what social benefits are. Now, going into the national level, what do we see? We see that the national policies and strategies do address equity as well, and the principles are mainstream, just as we saw with the international policies. One difference, though, is that both in Mexico and in Peru, equity was an overarching principle that was recognized as a crucial element in ensuring that you will have sustainable, that you can achieve sustainable development and the conservation objectives that the laws have. As I mentioned, many of the principles as well are recognized, and you have even specific sections on participation and on forest governance. What about perceptions? Well, when we got to the perceptions, we saw that the definitions are complex and multidimensional. They're usually associated with some of the concepts that I have right there: justice, well-being, social condition, addressing inequalities. But there are some differences as well. It was interesting that we saw that in Peru, for example, discussions focus on happiness. They said that when you were moving towards equity or you were achieving equity, you would have happier women and men. In Mexico, on the contrary, the definitions or the perceptions were very academic, and they were more focused on achieving social cohesion or substantive equality, which is a term that is defined only for Mexico, and it is defined in their legal system. Now, when we move into implementation and when we develop these theories of change and ask what equitable outcomes you would like to see when implementing these forest-related activities or these REDD activities, we see as well that participants were recognizing outcomes that were related to the 3 dimensions of equity. What is interesting from our results is that, and what was pointed out, are several things. First of all, that some of these outcomes or equitable activities are well known to practitioners and project implementers. Second of all, it was quite interesting that they highlighted that in order to be able to get equitable outcomes or to have the equitable benefit sharing, you had some prerequisites with regards to recognition and some equitable procedures that needed to be in place. However, they did mention that an important thing is that even though these are prerequisites, we should not see them as a pathway, that many of the actions or outcomes of recognition and procedure are on their own or have merit on their own, and some of them are crucial. For example, going back to the example that I was using before about women and youth, just recognizing them from the beginning, just projects recognizing from the beginning would be a big enough paradigm shift in the forest sector because, again, they're usually excluded or not recognized. Now, we see then that we have the 3 dimensions addressed in policies, perceptions, that they're found in, as well, implementation. But as we say in my country, not everything that shines is gold. And so you might have certain situations where you have things that might look equitable, and you might have the 3 dimensions interconnected, and you might think that if you have ensured that you have addressed the issues in the 3 dimensions, you will have an equitable REDD plus benefit sharing. But we have seen some situations where this might not be the case. For example, some policies might recognize right holders, but not all other forest stakeholders who are crucial for the effectiveness of REDD. We saw this, for example, in Mexico, where you have rural lands are called ejidos, and ejidos have land tenure rights that have been assigned a very long time ago. Now, as time has passed, this was back in the 40s, 60s, so a long time has passed, and nowadays ejidos have a combination of ejidatarios, right holders, and people that are neighbors or avecindados that are recognized by the community, and they are interacting as well with the forest. So you have a situation where when you're thinking about REDD and its effectiveness, you have 2 types of stakeholders, some with rights, some without rights, that will have, again, a tremendous impact on the success of REDD. Another situation that you might have is that you might have great policies, like we saw in Peru and Mexico, that are quite strong when it comes to equity. But the reality on the ground is that you still face great inequalities. And this was something that was stressed by all of the participants in our action research. Another situation that we might have is that policies might promote, participation, inclusion, decision-making. But we know that these don't usually correlate, and that in many cases you have elites capturing decision-making. This, again, is observed in many situations related to women and to youth, where you might have them participating, you might have measures to include them, to empower them, but when it comes to decision-making, there is still a big gap. Then the next one would be you might have a good governance structure, but certain social norms might prevent equitable strategies being implemented. This was an example, or this idea comes from an example in Peru, where, for example, when we were asking how benefits should be distributed, what should they be based on, when talking to some of the indigenous groups, they said that benefits could not be distributed based on the contribution, on the individual contribution, because this goes against their cosmovision, where they value the collective and try to promote the well-being of the collective versus the individual. So we would have there that you might have some good governance, but not be able to implement it due to the social norms. You might also have that the equitable benefit sharing might be reduced due to the high transaction costs, for example, that are associated to some processes, for example, participatory processes. So these are the lessons learned, and I'm about to be done, Matt. Some of the lessons learned we uncovered throughout the research. First of all, REDD plus policies and strategies, of course, should recognize all of the 3 dimensions and many different issues within of these dimensions. We also found that secure land or forest tenure is highly desirable, but when this is not as possible, you can still foresee you can still foresee the achievement of some equitable outcomes. Then REDD plus initiatives as well should consider all right holders and stakeholders who have a role in ensuring the success, including those without formal tenure rights. There are some creative ways that they have gone around. In Mexico, for example, they've created cooperatives or community associations that have a legal recognition to be able to include avecindados and women, which are usually not ejidatarios. And then last but not least, women's and youth interests and rights should be integral to REDD, not an add-on or a separate agenda. We need to, when thinking of the elements and issues in the 3 dimensions, always think about the gender and intergenerational equity. I don't want to leave you in this note, but actually I want to propose a way forward, and we discuss what should we take into account in our study, and very quickly I will show you we have identified 10 building blocks for an equitable REDD. I'm not going to go through them because we're running out of time, but if you read our publication, you will see that these are not new. What we do want to stress is the importance of ensuring that when you're developing any REDD Plus activity, or when you're proposing a REDD Plus program, you should take into account these building blocks within the different dimensions of equity. Because this is the only way that you will be able to ensure that you are identifying and addressing all of the issues and the elements related to equity within the 3 dimensions. And with that, I am done. I would like to thank you all for listening and being able to share some experience.
Thanks, Andrea. Are there any questions for Andrea that someone would like to see addressed? Great. John, can you help me, to pass these out? So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to collect questions and bring them back to the panel, so if you can write them down. Just John, right back next to Brian. Great. Any other questions that anyone would like to? Perfect. Okay. Great. So, I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing myself. Unexpected honor. And I have to read from my notes here. My name is Matt Somerville. I'm the Chief of Party of the USAID Land Tenure and Global Climate Change Program. It's a global program. We're based in Zambia and Myanmar, and then doing global analyses. Looking at the relationship between strengthening land and resource tenure and achieving adaptation and mitigation benefits. My background is in behavioral economics of incentives for ecosystem services, and I'm a senior associate with Tetra Tech, a USAID implementing organization. So, in the interest of time, I should also keep track of my own time. So, today's presentation, I want to focus on some tangible experiences in securing land and resource tenure from USAID's variety of programs over the past 30 years. They're not all REDD programs, but many of these incremental steps are relevant to REDD, and hopefully we'll sort of break apart this issue of tenure is too big, too complex, too political, too expensive. We look at this question, which a good mentor of mine, Mark Freudenberg, sort of posed out there when he started getting involved in climate change. It's a question of who owns the trees. It seems pretty straightforward, but those of us who sort of open their eyes to the tenure lens realize that it's actually a bundle of rights or a bundle of charcoal. In many of the places we work, people may have rights to use trees for subsistence use, but not rights to commercialize trees. You may gain access and legitimate legal rights to agricultural land by cutting down trees. And so by unbundling this bundle of rights and thinking about where people have rights and where they don't have rights, they may have management responsibilities, but no rights to benefit. These are all resource tenure questions. Okay, tenure is not just, do I have a piece of paper? It's also about that relationship between governance as well. And the way I look at it is that if you have rights, you should be using the carrot, the positive incentive. If people don't have rights, then enforcement is likely the approach that's going to be taken. Now, we have a huge variety of situations where there are legitimate stakeholders who do not have rights, who, on first glance, would be receiving the negative incentive. This is where we should be focusing our tenure interventions. Where are there stakeholders who need to be moved from the enforcement to the carrot? And that's what I hope to describe, some examples of how to do that. So tenure has been part of the forest carbon discussion from the very beginning. from afforestation, reforestation. Initially seen as a risk, okay? Recognizing that people who do not have clear rights to tenure represent a risk to emission reduction achievements. We've seen in the Carbon Fund methodological framework more ideas of identification of rights holders, of benefit sharing, of building tenure into the design of programs, and becoming part of an intervention. And then with the CCB standards, we see explicit recognition of the role of customary, historical, traditional, potentially non-written resource rights, and the importance that tenure plays in the disputes that you encounter in a program. I think one of the challenges of tackling tenure security has been that it comes in at every phase. Initially, people were thinking about, is it a precondition? You can't move forward until you have secure tenure. We realized in many countries it takes 10, 15, 20 years. In Zambia, where I work, they estimate that at the current rate of titling, it will take 3,000 years to title the whole country, okay? Moving from 100,000 plots to 30 million plots, if that's the approach you want to take. So what we argue now is that building this as a piece of the intervention is crucial, okay? And too often, not too often, it's good. We see strengthened tenure and resource rights as an outcome of REDD programs. You see it as a benefit, co-benefit. That's great, it is, but I encourage to see it as part of the intervention. It's an input, not just an output. So these, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the excuses about why we hear that we can't address tenure. Too expensive. Going back to the first economic analyses of REDD implementation, clarifying rights was the most expensive piece. So USAID, through the Tenure and Global Climate Change Project and the Property Rights and Resource Governance Project, and the work in 30-plus countries, 20-plus countries, has looked at program design and developed a variety of tools and a variety of practical experiences around understanding what the current tenure systems are and are there stakeholders who are being missed out. In building on Andrea's presentation and Phil's, the central piece of tenure to understanding what are the procedural rights that people are associated with, consultation, consent, and decisions. So, from the global level, we've worked with countries and done resource rights assessments in Nepal, Guatemala, Panama, Honduras, associated with the Carbon Fund methodological framework. The challenge remains getting these assessments, as many of us have seen, implemented into the program design. There's so many assessments involved. How does tenure stand out or integrate? So what I want to focus now on are 5 case studies, or 6 countries, where there have been practical pieces, okay? The first thing that needs to happen, or should happen, is the recognition of customary rights at the same level as statutory rights. What we see in many of the countries we work in, post-independence, is that the state simply took the colonial forest laws and put them into the state's hands. The colonial forest laws, which were built to provide resources to the colonial regimes, and those then became property of the state, okay? And the customary rights oftentimes were not recognized. De facto, those customary rights still exist, traditional rules and resources, but they aren't necessarily recognized at an equal level. In Liberia, post-civil conflict in the 2006 forest law that USAID was involved in supporting technical support around, there was a subsequent community rights law that established the right for communities to engage in community forest management and sort of claim or recognize those historical rights. There's a great piece of work on how to build statutory recognition of customary rights done by Rachel Knight and others through the FAO. It has some really even more practical examples. But it's not enough just to recognize rights, okay? In Liberia, what we saw is a recognition of rights of communities and of native titles dating back about 100 years. And through a Global Witness campaign, it was soon found that in just 2 years, private companies had engaged with these historical titles that dated back 100 years to cover a huge portion of the country. Those were subsequently found to be sort of fraudulent in some cases, but what we're seeing now is that those same individuals who went to individual native titles are now coming to community forests and saying, oh, we'll help you develop the community forest rights for your community if you transfer over your rights to log and benefits. So those are some of the dynamics, that recognizing rights is an important first step, but it needs to be followed up. We then have this issue of tree tenure, the ownership of trees being divorced from ownership of land, okay, that exists in many, many countries. Devolving tree rights to flow with the land rights is an important step to incentivize people to plant trees, because if you don't have the right to a tree you plant, why are you going to plant? And also to make forests valuable to people who would otherwise access land rights by cutting down trees. This example from the regreening of the Sahel has been commonly cited. Over the past 30 years, USAID has been one of many different institutions that supported that process, but tenure reform has been a piece of the pie. Importantly, and fairly recently, USAID has supported integrated land policy. And if we look at Vietnam and mangrove forests, we all know that mangroves are one of the most ecologically complex systems, but also from a governance perspective, they are one of the most complex systems. You have forest departments that aren't typically trained to work on coastal forests. You have aquaculture industries. You have tourism. You have a range of institutions that aren't used to working together that are now interacting in this landscape. So working on policy at a landscape level as opposed to a sectoral level has been sort of a nice approach to clarify rights and responsibilities. Then if we think of the work of USAID and the historical work in Brazil around recognizing indigenous rights with the Suruí tribe had their rights demarcated and defined in the early 1990s. But it was the fact that those rights were defined and that it was clear in the legal framework that allowed investment to flow to focus on management and enforcement. It's really hard to get people to manage a resource if they don't know the boundaries or don't feel like they have a legal security to those boundaries. So tenure becomes an enabling addition, but resource management enforcement is also a tenure question. And then there's two cases that USAID is getting increasingly involved in around low-cost documentation of resource rights at the community level, at the household level. We have the case that I'm working on in Zambia, where we're piloting land and resource rights documentation and seeing whether that's leading to increased adoption of climate-smart agriculture when people have secure documentation of their rights. And Zambia is increasingly interested in integrating these lessons into their legal framework. On the other side, you have a legal framework in Indonesia that has space for recognition of customary rights and of rights to forest, that through USAID grants to local partners, we see communities trialing these interesting legislative possibilities so that that can lead to actual sort of clearer steps for implementation. All of this work is built on a decade of non-strictly forest work that USAID has done on land tenure and property rights to help people demystify the dynamics. And nothing like a matrix to demystify, or people claim it demystifies and just confuses. Anyways, it is a nice resource in breaking apart the elements of tenure, from conflict resolution to legal frameworks to rights recognition to land administration, and the typical constraints that people face. Importantly, it not just says this is the problem, but it provides a variety of almost a box to learn from of effective interventions that have been used out there. It's a really nice resource. The other side that USAID is getting increasingly involved in is mobile applications to secure tenure. So helping communities document their own resource rights, sort of similar to the platform that WRI recently launched, Landmark, but also to integrate those into national legal frameworks. So we have a booth out at the Landscapes Laboratory to see how some of these are working. So in summary, there's about sort of 5 policy and field interventions that I wanted to highlight. Recognizing customary rights at the same level as statutory rights, devolving rights to trees to flow with the land, developing holistic land policies, focusing on management and enforcement after you've clarified the rights to resources, and then documenting household resource rights, both to inform policy and in some case to demonstrate progressive policy that exists but is not currently being implemented. So I think that is all. Yes, merci. Great. So. Are there any questions that people would like to raise on this side? Holding your questions till you can go to the mic then, I suppose. Okay. Oh, great. Sorry. I'll bring these back in just a moment after I introduce. Thanks, I try. Sorry, we're freestyling this event. Okay. Without any further ado, I want to introduce our third presentation before we run to a discussion panel. Sorry, I'm still from Grace. Grace Wong, sorry, is a senior scientist at C4, and she coordinates the project on REDD benefit sharing in an ASEAN-Swiss partnership on social forestry and climate change. Prior to joining C4 in 2012, Grace worked for the UNDP in Laos on the Poverty Environment Initiative and for Conservation International in Washington, D.C. Grace has a PhD in natural resource economics from the University of Florida, and she'll be presenting on governance, rights, and the role of politics in REDD equity.
Thank you. That was generous before I spoke. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. Thanks to Matt for coordinating this really complex constellation of speakers and sessions. What I'd like to talk about is something a little bit building on what has been talked about by Andrea and Matt, but also look at it at a different angle. What we have done in this project on benefit sharing is that we've done so much research on different angles, from the governance issues, from contextual policies, and benefit sharing on the ground. And what I'd like to present is a little bit of a framework on how we would evaluate all of these as part of a policy options at the national or subnational level for REDD+ and benefit sharing. So it's just a quick outline. I'll give you just a couple of slides on what we've been doing in this project and some of the research that we're carrying out, and then present very briefly this framework for how we are trying to evaluate different policies that are being implemented, and policies for REDD+, but also policies for forest governance and land issues that kind of relate to REDD+. And we present a case study of the payment for forest ecosystem services in Vietnam as a way of illustrating how this framework will work. Okay, so very quickly, the REDD+ benefit sharing project is a 4-year project. We're right around coming to an end now. We're working in 6 countries. And the objective really is to kind of provide policymakers and practitioners with policy options on how you might design REDD+ benefit sharing mechanisms that are effective, efficient, and equitable. So it's this policy options that kind of frame what we are doing, because it means that we do have to look at things from multiple perspectives and multiple scales to look at what these options mean. So I talked about efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. So the way that we are doing this research, from the efficiency side, we're looking at cost efficiency of policies and measures both at the national level and at the subnational pilot REDD+ initiatives level. So at the national level, we're looking at different forest policies that are being implemented, what might be an efficient policy mix, what might be the mix of enforcement, fines, as well as carrots like PES or like REDD+. So what is this mix? At the subnational or REDD+ project level, we're looking at implementation costs and also opportunity costs of subnational initiatives. Effectiveness, we're looking at effectiveness of the institutions, enabling institutions that actually support an effective REDD+. And here we're looking at multi-level governance and really decisions regarding decision-making on forests. And this multi-level governance aspect is really critical, particularly in countries with decentralized rights, which is, at some level, is very present in all the 6 countries we work in. And then rights and tenure arrangements, different bundles of rights, how they affect benefit sharing. In terms of equity, we've been asking several questions. I think Andrea highlighted this. Who should have the right to benefit from REDD? It is just the ones with rights? Is it the ones that are actually carrying out actions that enable REDD Plus to happen? Is it the ones that are protecting forests? So, you know, unpacking this, who should benefit from REDD is really critical. And who decides these beneficiaries? And in the meantime, who are bearing the costs and risks of REDD Plus type policies and strategies? At a different level, we're also asking the question of local perceptions. So how does local people, local communities, local governments, what are the perceptions of equity? How do they perceive equity, and how does then REDD Plus benefit sharing fit within this equitable framework? So as Andrea also highlighted, equity is very multidimensional and rather complex. So given that we're doing all this research and we're looking at it from policy side, from institutional side, and at the local level, it's really difficult to try and evaluate how all these interlinked policies and measures can affect the outcomes on the ground to kind of achieve the objectives of REDD Plus that we've set out at the national level or the subnational level. So what we've tried to do is come up with this kind of broad evaluation framework. It's a way of providing a shared working understanding at different levels, how you could see different factors play together, and what might be the trade-offs between the three E's, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity that we talk about. And the key thing is the framework is to evaluate, but it's also a way of generating learning. So where we find these trade-offs, where we find there are issues to consider, we hope that these are feedback loops towards improving policy as part of the mix that a government has to consider. So briefly, this is the framework. As you could see, well, starting from your left to right, first, of course, you have at the national level or subnational level policy objectives for REDD Plus, whether it's environment policy objectives such as reducing emissions, increasing forest cover. There are, in many cases, also social objectives to REDD Plus, reduce poverty, increase rural development. And there's a different variety of policy instruments that are in place. It could be direct regulation, stronger enforcement, fines, as we have seen that's worked very well in the Brazilian Amazon. There's also maybe carrots that's thrown in the mix, incentives. That are administrative measures, which is, restructuring maybe how forest is managed. In Indonesia, there was an experiment in having an independent REDD Plus agency, for example, and now it's been all restructured and merged together in a broader forestry and environment ministry. So how does these administrative measures work? And within that sits benefit sharing. So all these affect the regulators, the beneficiaries, to achieve the outcomes we desire. Underneath it all, of course, is all the contextual issues that are really critical and really important. And so things like capacity, things like rights, things like governance, things like bureaucracy and transparency, information flows. So we're trying to look at this mix. Okay, so these are just our criteria. Once again, we look at 3 E's. Effectiveness in reaching outcomes, cost efficiency, equity. We also take a multidimensional approach, very similar to what Phil and Andrea has put forth, but maybe categorized in a slightly different way. We look at procedural, participation, access, inclusion. We look at distributive, how benefits are shared, what are their impacts. And what is considered contextual, which means the existing factors that actually influence equity. So it could be things like rights, for example, that fit in there. And then we apply this framework to Vietnam and to specifically look at a national program of payment for forest environmental services. We didn't really look at a REDD Plus example because in many cases, REDD Plus are still implemented. There are certain policies that are in place. There are certain, this rather fragmented. So we picked this case study because the payment for forest environmental services is a national policy program. It's been in place for over 5 years. So there is a process for which we can test this evaluation framework. So very quickly, for the institutional context factors, we looked at the forest allocation process. This is a devolution of rights to local communities. This is a practice, this is a national priority, and this is really a process of really allocating forest rights. And this has a lot to do with governance, bureaucracy, there's a lot of capacity issues and rights. So I'll give a little bit of results from this part. And then from the aspect of outcomes, we look at local perspectives of equity. What our hypothesis is that if local people actually consider an incentive to be fair or to be equitable, it would strengthen the sustainability of achieving those outcomes. So this is based on a lot of frameworks that the PES community has been studying in how equity is really a foundation for achieving outcomes. So here we studied then the local people's perceptions of equity regarding this PFAS payment. What do they think? How is it motivating their actions? And how do they perceive this incentive? So some results, and I apologize here for the over text, but so in terms of effectiveness, we find this forest land allocation processes to vary very widely. And in many cases, it has been implemented very poorly because there is lack of real reliable data on what are forest areas, where are the forest areas, and how communities could get there. So this is, can be an issue. This is a real issue because it is these local community rights that is a precursor to being able to access PFAS benefits. So this incomplete forest land allocation processes really also causes delay and in the distribution of PFAS benefits. And in a lot of cases, because this has not been done very well, they are redoing the forest land allocation process again. And this has also, in some cases, created conflict because redrawing boundaries a second time, trying to figure out what goes where also creates a lot of uncertainty in what land uses are allowed and not allowed. However, in some regions that we've studied, the FLA has very strong participatory processes. From the viewpoint of the institutional, of the local government, this is very time intensive, very costly, we don't have enough money. But from the local perspectives, this is really what is providing legitimacy to the process, and this is really important. At the institutional level, there are some equity concerns, largely because a large chunk of the good quality forests are typically under state-managed plantation companies, and what has been allocated to communities are more poorer quality, sometimes not really forests, but still classified as forests. So forests without trees, basically. So these are, sometimes allocated to local companies, communities. So that's been a kind of a large institutional inequity there. In terms of the local level, information asymmetry is an issue. It's all one way downwards. There's lack of participation. Payment distribution is intransparent. The local people have largely equated equity with equality. And this was, in a sense, we thought, very, very similar to kind of the socialist government or the socialist political situation of Vietnam. But as we dig deeper, there's also a lot of concern. We want equality for social cohesion, but we also want more when we do more. So there is an inherent tension between equality and also merit-based equity. And one thing we found that was an issue is that a lot of the payments into this PFAS fund is by hydropower companies who pay, a little fee on top of the electricity they generate for water services. However, a lot of this cost is also transferred back to the customers by having higher utility bills. So there is a bit of a transference of cost and also transference of responsibility, and that's also a big sense of equity problems. So my last slide, what have we learned from testing this evaluation framework for REDD+? So for the forest land allocation process, as we've also heard from Matt, the tenure issue, FLA implicates rights, access, and benefits. So how this is done well or not well really affects kind of the governance of a forest and how incentives might even work. So what we have also found, as have the previous speakers, is forest land processes that are inclusive and that consider also historical land use practices in those regions and not just based on, which community are there now and, allocating lands in this kind of simplified way. So that creates more legitimacy for REDD+. And we find the local equity perspectives is really colored by social, cultural, and political norms. In Vietnam, it is very socialist, as I said, and it's also very hierarchical. So it's very much dominated by local leaders, by village heads, by commune leaders, by the Communist Party, in how some of these norms affect. So trying to kind of dig into what the varied and multiplicity of local equity perspectives would be critical, and also trying to avoid this transference of costs and transference of risk is also really important. And finally, what we wanted to say is in all of this, there's a huge element of institutional history and also politics, trying to decide the objectives of a benefit sharing mechanism, who has the responsibility for actually reducing deforestation. Just by transferring incentive to the local level, is it households that are now responsible for reducing deforestation within this whole complex mix of issues? And whose perspective counts? So these are issues that we need to really consider as we think about a 3E REDD+. So a lot of this work comes from a whole series of studies that we've done, and they're all available in this booth that we have in the REDD+ Pavilion. That's my little marketing. And it's also available at our website. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Grace. Okay, so are there any questions that people would like to submit for Grace? Okay, there's one back there from Bob. Great. We'll see whether we have time to fully discuss these after our panel. And there's a couple more to collect back there if you want. Thank you. Okay, so we were planning on inviting the panel to come up at this point, but given the seating of the room, we had the panel up from the very beginning. So apologies if that was awkward, but we'll now introduce our three panelists, and we'll then pose a question to each of them, and then come around with a second round of questions based on some, and back to, sorry, our presenters. I hope that's all right. I have the pleasure of introducing Phil Franks, who's a senior researcher at IIED on the far end of the row. Is focused on social dimensions of natural resource management and conservation, with a particular focus on better understanding and applying social equity in this context. And he's also involved on behalf of CARE International with the International Secretariat for REDD+ SES. Next to Phil, we have William Sunderland, who is a principal scientist at C4. William is the leader of the REDD+ project sites work in the C4's global comparative study, which has provided an amazing amount of empirical information on early REDD initiatives. His experiences are in tenure and property rights, livelihoods, and the underlying causes of deforestation. And next to William, we have Liliana Lozano, the project director of the dedicated grant mechanism of the Forest Investment Program in Peru. Liliana is based out of WWF Peru, but is acting as the national, which is acting as the national executing agency of the DGM. She's worked in corporate, public, and nonprofit sectors, and in recent years has been working in Peru on implementing projects related to strengthening indigenous populations' participation in national and regional agendas. Great. With that, I'd like to pose the first question to Phil. Phil, building on the presentation, and I hope that you all can also reflect on anything you saw during these 3 presentations as well. What do you see as far as the gaps in terms of, yeah, please just grab a thing. The Cancun safeguards and sort of the UN framework around REDD in terms of equity, and how can we more effectively integrate equity into this REDD Plus regime?
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple of slides just to help me here. Right, so this is the framework that Andrea presented of the 3 dimensions, the way we're looking at equity in these 3 dimensions of recognition, procedure, and distribution. And the next slide, sorry, yes, keep going. Yeah, so this slide, Andrea also had, I'm just going to say a little bit more about this. So these are the Cancun safeguards, and we've tried to use our equity framework, or you could say lens, to look at these and to see how the safeguards relate to the different dimensions of equity in REDD. The first Cancun safeguard being about complementing existing objectives and relevant international conventions and agreements. Of course, the international conventions and agreements, including international human rights law, cover all 3 dimensions of equity. Moving on to the second one, transparency and forest governance structures. The next, whoever's managing the slides, push the button. Yeah, okay. So transparency and governance are issues related primarily to procedure, but governance also very much about recognition. Who has a seat at the table in decision making, as well as the processes of decision making themselves. Likewise, full and effective participation. The third one, respect for knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples and members of local communities. Clearly that's a recognition and respect of rights. The fourth one, participation, is a governance issue in the realm of procedure. The fifth one, this is where things get a little more gappy, you might say. Sorry, could you, keep it there. So the fifth one. So at the tail end of the 5th Cancun safeguard, there is this statement that REDD should enhance social and environmental benefits. That is a distributive issue, but the Cancun safeguard says nothing about who should get the benefits, what criteria should be used to decide who gets what. And that's why that line is very much a dotted line there. Okay, the next slide. So, as Matt said, I work part of my time on the REDD Plus Social and Environmental Standards Initiative. You may be familiar with the sort of principles, criteria, and indicators that we have developed as a tool to help people interpret safeguards at the national level and as the basis for a safeguard information system. Now, if you look at those, and these were developed, this version was developed in 2012, so that's 3 years ago. We were not thinking that although there is a principle about equitable benefit sharing, we recognize that we were not addressing equity in all the dimensions. So when you look at use our lens to look at these, you see recognition is pretty well covered, both in the rights issues and the issues about knowledge in institutions. Procedure also likewise pretty well covered. Distribution, again, we have an issue here, and as Andrea explained, basically you can distribute benefits according to 5 different types of criteria. You can do it according to the results people achieve, that's a merit, results and efforts, that's a merit-based approach, according to costs they incur, in particular opportunity costs in REDD, the rights they have over the forest, or their needs, and that's what we often call a pro-poor approach, i.e. sort of trying to address poverty and basic needs. So we have quite a number of indicators on the last one. We have one on rights, which relates to securing tenure rights, that REDD programs must secure tenure rights, customary rights, and nothing on the other 3. The reason is the other 3, you can't be prescriptive about the other 3, or indeed all 5, because the weighting you give to these different criteria here depends on the context. So in fact, you cannot, the reason they're not in the Cancun Safeguards and REDD SES is partly because you cannot be prescriptive. There's no universal prescription for these things here. It is nationally and locally context specific. So, but it's interesting to note the last point, that 42 out of all the 64 indicators, that's 2/3 actually addressing equity principles. So the equity is a major feature of the REDD SES principles, criteria and indicators. I just wanted to say one other thing on the gaps. That there is an issue about social differentiation. The issue about when you talk about procedure, are you specifically looking at women, youth, different ethnic groups, etc.? And the Cancun Safeguards are sort of blind on that issue. In REDD SES, we tried very hard to engender the process, and this version has a lot about the rights, procedural recognition, procedure rights of women, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups. And also grievance mechanisms is not referred to in Cancun Safeguards. Again, that is an issue that is in REDD SES. And also within the broad framework of what a country safeguards approach should involve. So in fact, although it is absent from Cancun Safeguards, it is in many countries within their overall safeguards approach.
Great, thanks, Phil. It sounds like we have some sort of serendipitous or some good positives within the framework, and then some areas where there's some clear gaps as well. Great. Secondly, for Liliana, who's coming to us from the grant mechanism of the Forest Investment Program in Peru. So I understand, Liliana, that the DGM in Peru, unlike the other 5 or 7 FIP countries, is focusing explicitly on land tenure and titling of indigenous communities. And we're sort of wondering what the evolution of that is. How did that come to be?
Okay, well, first, good morning to everybody. And just hold on, I'm going to say something before the video. Okay. Good morning to everybody. First, to thank you for inviting me here to participate. And also, thank you for the presentation, because I think they were really interesting for us. And I'm going to tell you a story, if I can say that. And it's, I think that what helped me these presentations is to try to put this story in a framework of theory, which they are trying to put in this level. So first, I would like to put a video that is going to introduce you to what is the DGM and how we come to the DGM project in Peru.
Peru ranks second in South America and 9th in the world in terms of natural forests. The Amazon region covers 61% of Peru's territory, which is equal to 73.3 million hectares, or the total surface area of Norway and Switzerland. Of this total, approximately 15 million hectares are owned or managed by 2,000 indigenous communities, who use their traditional knowledge to protect and conserve these forests, their home. In recognition of their role in protecting the Amazon, the World Bank, via the Forest Investment Program, or FIP, is working directly and in partnership with the communities of the Peruvian Amazon for the first time.
Y estamos dispuestos a cumplir con mucha responsabilidad, con mucha seriedad y demostrar a los bancos multilaterales si los pueblos indígenas saben utilizar eficientemente los recursos y también las actividades, proyectos que están enmarcados dentro de este gran proyecto que es MDE.
The Peru Dedicated Grant Mechanism, DGM for short, is a special initiative under the Forest Investment Program. It is being developed by the World Bank jointly with the National Steering Committee, composed of 5 members from IDESEP and 5 from CONAP, 2 national Amazon indigenous organizations that represent more than 350,000 indigenous people and will ensure their voices will be heard. During early preparation, two main components have been defined for the DGM in Peru. Firstly, land titling, legalization and registration. And secondly, indigenous forest management, with transversal activities that will support strengthening indigenous capacity and governance in land titling and forest management, along with a focus on gender equality.
En primer lugar, los pueblos han dicho su territorio. Hay que darle la seguridad jurídica de los territorios. Sin territorios, los pueblos no tienen razón para seguir existiendo como pueblos.
During 2014, the World Bank and the Amazonian leaders worked to define the specific activities for each of the two components. They identified 20 million hectares of land that need to be titled, and community-based activities that support sustainable forest management. The FIP subcommittee has allocated an initial fund of $5.5 million that will be administered by WWF Peru, which was selected by the National Steering Committee to be the national executing agency for the DGM, and they will also offer technical assistance.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. So this is more or less the idea of what is the DGM. As you see, the DGM is part of the FIP, so and in the case of Peru, it comes directly with Peru received $50 million for the forest investment plan, and then also received $5 million for DGF, what is the dedicated grant mechanism for indigenous people. And I show this video because first I would like you to let you know why the indigenous people in Peru decided to focus most of the funding, or more or less 60% of the funding, to the land title. What happened in Peru is that first the deforestation rate is increasing a lot, but besides that, which is I think it's the most important, is that we still have some problems, some conflicts about lands. So there are a lot of, you have indigenous communities who are not really protected, they don't have really land rights now, and you have forest dealers who go there and try to invade their territory. So when they were developing the initiative of the DGM Peru, just 3 months before, I think, in September last year, in 2014, one of the indigenous leaders who was claiming for the land title in his territory, he was killed for forest people who were just trying to invade their territory. And he was claiming for the land rights for their territory for more or less than 4 years. So once it happened, the indigenous leader in Peru, I think the Amazon, and they really decided that it's important to focus on this of land title. So in the case of Peru, and also what we think at WWF is that REDD for us, and also I think for indigenous people in Peru, in the Amazonian, is that REDD really brings like opportunity to build forest governance in the region. So it brings opportunity to put together both indigenous community, indigenous leader, and also the government in the same table and to discuss what they can do. So in the case of the DGM, I think it could be an example of the indigenous participation in these decision-making processes in REDD funding. So in the case of the DGM Peru, DGM came with a big guideline. So the main idea of the global DGM is that you have to focus more in strength indigenous capacities to participate in the FIP negotiations there in Peru. But the guidelines were more focused on how do you strengthen more capacity building. And then when they have these internal discussions, I mean, among the indigenous leaders, among this national steering committee, they saw that instead of focusing more in capacity building, instead of focusing more in building capacity there in the indigenous leaders, they decided, okay, we really want to contribute to the REDD, to the implementation of the forest investment plan strategy there in Peru, we need to focus on solving these enabling conditions, which are related to land title and recognition. So in the process where they develop this DGM Peru, the design of the project of DGM Peru, they have to have these discussions with the government first, but also with the World Bank, because it was a common design between the World Bank and indigenous leaders grouped in this national steering committee. And then you have these two expectations. So from one side, you have indigenous people expectations that obviously, as you heard, the indigenous leader with indigenous community, what they want is that in order to start any project, they need to think about land tenure. You need to secure their land in order to think about how I'm going to use the land first, and then how I'm going to secure the territory that I have. So I at least will avoid invasion of different things. At least I can claim for the land if I have some kind of land rights. So I think that one of the main things that they know is the basic of the indigenous culture. We need to start first with land rights, and then comes different things like life plans, like indigenous economy and that. But the basics is always land rights. So the basics also for REDD is always land rights. And then capacity building could come in a way. So that's why they decided to focus on that. But from the other side, they also have to find a way to contribute to the forest investment plan in Peru. That was the other point. So they have the funding, the allocation of the funding has to go directly to comply their expectations as indigenous people in the Amazonia, but also has to comply with the forest investment plan in Peru has already agreed with the different donors. It was also a really interesting process when the Peruvian government developed the forest investment plan for Peru. They also make a participative process. Well, it took like a long time to make it participative, but at least they did it, including indigenous people there. So in the forest investment plan, you have one component that is regarding to legalization, titling, and registration of property rights, which include communal and private property. So there is a big component that is related to land titling in the forest investment plan. So you have a context in Peru that now promote and foster land titling and land recognition in the region. So the DGM Peru decided to contribute to that, but also to do the synergies with them. So face to this, if you have you have all these indigenous people expectations when they have to make a decision with the World Bank, how they are going to allocate that 5.5 million for 5 years, where the indigenous leaders are really the decision-making, they have the decision-making power on that funding. They are going to be the one who are going to decide what to do and where to invest that. And in this case, GLF is the one who only administrates the funding, but also is the one who also provides technical advice and technical support on that. So I think that the two things that makes the difference in this process is that they decided to allocate the 100% of the budget directly to the indigenous organization. So no funding for institutional strengthening, no funding for capacity building, no more workshops, no more activities. They decided, okay, let's try to put all this money directly to the regional, to the subnational organizations. And for land titling, there are 3 things that they decided. One is recognition of indigenous communities. Some of them are, they exist many years ago, for so many years, but some of them don't have recognition. So one of the main goals that they have is to get the recognition of 310 indigenous communities, and that's the first step. If you want to claim for rights, for land rights, you first need to be recognized by the government. So you need to have like your ID, your exist for the government. Now there are a lot that they don't exist. There are more or less, if I'm not wrong, more than 500 or 600 communities registered now, well, not registered, identified by these 2 national indigenous organizations that are not really recognized by the government. So they didn't do all the process to be recognized and to get their ID, recognition as indigenous community. So this is the first step, because this is the first level that you have to, in the process to get your land title, you need first to be recognized. You need first to exist to the legal form.
Liliana,
So,
just one more moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. All mismining. And then the other component of the project is land titling. So the project first would like to have 310 indigenous communities recognized, 115 indigenous communities with land titling in the following years. And also the last part was just come with equity. One of the main claims for the indigenous women, it was that they would like to be present also in this one. So they allocate part of the more or less 40% of the funding allocated for indigenous projects that will relate to indigenous economy will go directly to indigenous women. So indigenous women leaders. So the idea is to try to distribute all this funding mainly to work from the basis. Indigenous recognition of indigenous land, that's one. land titling, and also the recognition of the women have to have a really huge participation in this process.
Thanks, Liliana. I think we need
that's
to,
all.
yeah, I think we need to move on. Thank you for that, and that actually comes to our final question. Well, our final panelist, and thanks, William, for sitting up here for an hour and 20 minutes till you get your turn. But I think one of the questions from the audience sort of builds on the question that we have here for you. So, you know, you've been focusing on lessons learned through the global comparative study. And I guess the question is, what are some of the advancements that have been made in laying an appropriate and feasible tenure framework in one or two of the, you know, the larger countries where REDD Plus needs to be implemented, Brazil or Indonesia? And sort of what are the deficiencies that sort of need to be addressed? And building on that, I think a question that we had from the audience was, what can we do around these initiatives if we're not getting adequate support from government, the political will to go forward with tenure or equity recognition? So I don't know if you can reflect on that in your...
Thank you, Matt. So let me address those two questions and then the one that you just posed. And I'll also throw in a couple comments on two of the presentations earlier. And I promise to be quick and telegraphic, and I apologize in advance to the translators. So big picture comments first on Brazil and Indonesia. Forests in both countries are intensely contested, as they are throughout the tropics. Second, Brazil is way out ahead of Indonesia in the state recognition of rights. They are polar opposites when you look across the globe at big countries involved in REDD. In Brazil, about 2/3 of the forest estate is formally in the hands of indigenous peoples and communities, whether it be access rights or ownership rights, and that percentage in Indonesia is lower than 2%. Given this tenurial advantage, one would think that Brazil is way ahead in tenure preparations for REDD than Indonesia is. And it turns out that in some ways they are, but in very meaningful ways they are not. And that's what I want to get at in these brief comments. Let me first give my attention to Brazil, to the instruments there and their strengths and weaknesses. In Brazil, the Brazil Forest Code that dates back decades requires that there be an 80% minimum of forest cover in the legal Amazon. And in a tenure instrument that came up in 2009 called Terra Legal provides secure tenure to those who conform to the provisions of the Brazil Forest Code. And the aim is to have 5 million landholders in Brazil ultimately benefit from Terra Legal. And it's implemented through what's known as the CAR, C-A-R, which stands for Rural Environmental Registry. It's a tenure mechanism through which conformity to this 80% requirement is measured and monitored. Now the strong point, and this is really makes Brazil stand out in the world, is that it is a direct linkage between tenure titling requirements and environmental compliance. I mean, it's a dream mechanism as far as REDD is concerned. And more than that, REDD proponents can work directly with the government across scales, up and down scales of government, and government and NGOs work together on Terra Legal. The weak points are that for decades now, it has proven very difficult to enforce the terms of the Brazil Forest Code. It was reformed in 2012 as a result of the agricultural lobby. It's an intervention that ended up weakening its provisions. And roughly 90% of the then beneficiaries have gotten amnesty and do not have to fulfill the requirements of the Brazil Forest Code. And there's also been big challenges in implementing Terra Legal, especially in its first 2 years. But even though there's been an era of improvement, there continue to be some significant difficulties in assuring that Terra Legal works appropriately. I'll turn my attention now to Indonesia and 3 different legal instruments, if you will. By far the most important is a court decision, a constitutional court decision made 3 years ago. It's called decision number 35, and it's a national level decision that provides the basis for recognizing the rights of indigenous people, essentially recognizing customary forests and no longer classifying them as public lands. It has huge implications. It potentially turns over title to 40 million hectares, which is about 1/3 of the forest estate in Indonesia. So that's one. Another is the one map policy that dates back to 3 years ago. It's a national level effort to integrate the maps of different ministries which have contradictory information on land claims throughout the country. And REDD proponents have 2 different instruments for trying to establish rights of exclusion, in other words, keeping at bay exterior claimants on REDD forest lands. These are the Ecosystem Restoration Concession, or ERC, and the Village Forest Tenure category, known as Hutan Desa. Now, the strengths can be summed up as follows. Indonesia has entered a new era where the government has begun to get serious about providing tenure rights, recognizing tenure throughout the country. And this has barely been done before. But it faces enormous obstacles. Principal among them is the challenges faced by the Constitutional Court decision, MK35. For 2 years, the past Minister of Forestry actively tried to undermine it. We're in a much better situation right now. The new President, Jokowi, has stated his commitment to indigenous rights. And the new Minister of Environment and Forestry proposed recently that by 2009, they attain a target of 12.7 million hectares awarded to indigenous peoples. Which is great, but it's far, far beneath the target of AMAN, the National Indigenous Rights Organization. So in conclusion, the expected benefits of strong tenure mechanisms that are evident in Brazil in C4's research is not bearing out that they've had a strong advantage and far better results in providing tenure to local people in Brazil as compared to Indonesia. Stay tuned for more research results on that. So, and yet conditions for equitable tenure in both countries have never been better right now. The reason is that forests and climate change motivate state interests in turning forest management over to local people. What stands in the way? Many things, but nothing more important than what we call business as usual interest. Those being principally livestock and soy in Brazil and oil palm in Indonesia. To date, we've had limited progress both on tenure in REDD and on REDD in general. And it reflects humanity's and government's indecisiveness and ambivalence about what to do in climate change. And hopefully COP21 will take a step in the direction of resolving that indecisiveness. Yep. So a couple more comments. The question from the audience had to do with, if I remember correctly, what can we do for lack of political will? And certainly there is ample room for advocacy and civil society involvement at a level that has not yet been seen. It has been building over time, and I have no doubt that it will continue to build as a consequence of COP21. And just very brief comments on 2 of the prior presentations. It's an exciting time for REDD and tenure because equity in tenure in REDD is both an end in itself and it's a means to an end. But that's where the complexity lies, in the tension between tenure as an equity end and as a means to, for example, carbon effectiveness. And in Andrea's presentation, she and Phil raised the important point of what do we do in cases where people don't have full rights at the local level? Can we proceed? How can we proceed? And very concretely, I've seen a case in Cameroon where you have seasonal migrants to the local sites. And this is where I would ask you to take a careful look at where FPIC and permission fits in the picture of recognition. Because ultimately, who decides who is to be included and not included in REDD? If you turn it over entirely to villagers, they may well exclude those seasonal migrants. And lastly, Matt, on your presentation, paraphrasing what you said, what drives the agenda is to know where are there people who should be moved from the stick to the carrot. This is surely the essence of what REDD intended in introducing the idea of a performance-based mechanism. But the reality on the ground in the last 6 years is that the performance-based mechanism has barely been introduced. It's barely functioning. There's almost nothing in the way of an active forest carbon market. It's begun, but it is really not large. So a lot of the activity around equity and tenure has gone beyond that, and has gone beyond that to fulfill functions that I don't think we recognize sufficiently. Why? Because they go beyond the performance-based mechanism to do things that we tend not to recognize. And those tend to be to establish community forestry as a legitimate foundation for REDD, which it ought to be, by providing the basis for rights of exclusion, regardless of whether there's a performance-based mechanism, regardless of whether you have identified through the tenure mechanism the rightful beneficiaries of the stream of benefits. And certainly, last but certainly not least, we're beginning to see tenure reforms that are reflecting a shift away from privileged access to forest resources, to the powerful players, to the less powerful. That's all to the good, and it is not strictly related to REDD. Thank you.
So thanks very much to our panelists and the one round of questions that we had time for. The total sort of combined proposals for this session totaled about 4.5 hours. So this has been a 1.5 hour, and I apologize for the lack of sort of audience participation in this. However, if you bring your questions up, we need to submit a report back to C4 so we can integrate your questions into explicit responses into that report, if that will sort of suffice for participation and inclusion in this particular forum. Are there any, I don't know when this is just going to sort of cut off and, the formal exclusion, but are there any ending comments that we have from our presenters or anyone who'd like to? I think Phil put it nicely. So thank you all for coming. We hope this is the beginning and continuation of a dialogue. We all have booths. Please come and chat with us, and let's discuss this issue in the corridors.